I moved into the studio apartment on a Tuesday because it was the day the leasing office waived the application fee. That's not the kind of detail you usually remember, but for some reason it stuck in my head. The place was small, one big room with a kitchenette and a short hallway that led to a bathroom. It was in an old brick building that used to be a tannery, or so the maintenance guy told me. He said it like it gave the place character. To me, it just gave it a smell. Not bad, just old, like wet leather and dust. The selling point was that it was close to my new job and it was cheap. It had a single east-facing window that looked at the back alley. Buses rumbled by in the mornings, and the alley dumpsters got dragged around before sunrise on certain days, which was jarring. But I figured I'd get used to the noises. I told myself I'd only stay a year. You can tolerate a lot when you promise yourself it's temporary. I did all the normal moving in things. I wiped out cabinets and lined them with dollar store contact paper. I took a picture of the oven with the gas dials turned to off so I could stop checking it before bed. I set up my router on the counter by the fridge because there was an outlet there that looked the least sketchy. And I went around the place with my phone trying to find spots where reception didn't drop. That's how I first noticed the little mirror in the hallway. It was cheap, the kind of narrow mirror you'd buy in a college store and stick to your dorm room door. It was mounted at eye level and framed in thin fake wood. When I got close enough to see my pores, I also noticed something else. Hairline scratches in a circle the size of a quarter in the mirror's bottom left corner. Not a crack. Scratches, almost like someone had twisted a coin against the glass. I tried to angle my phone's flashlight to see if it was just weird lighting, but the scratches were real. It made no difference to me. I shrugged, hung a towel hook under it, and moved on. The first week was mostly boring. Work, groceries, a couple boxes that stayed packed because I was lazy. The place had a hardwired smoke detector that chirped until I hit the test button, and a carbon monoxide detector that was plugged into a wall outlet and showed a little green light. The landlord had left a digital alarm clock on the nightstand, still set for 6 a.m. I unplugged it because my phone was better, and I didn't want to be startled by some beeping I'd forgotten about. On my third night there, I woke up around 2:30 to a clicking sound. It was light and irregular, like someone tapping a fingernail on wood. I lay there, trying to decide if it was in my dream or the room. I don't know how long I listened to it before I realized it was coming from the kitchenette. The fridge. Every few seconds, click, click, click. The compressor kicking on and off, or something like that. I know fridges make noise, but in a nearly empty studio, small sounds don't have competition. They're just out there, hanging, with nothing to absorb them. I got up and opened the fridge. The light came on. There was nothing inside except a jar of pickles and a carton of eggs. I stood there like an idiot. The clicking had stopped. I shut the door, waited, and listened. Nothing. I went back to bed and slept through my alarm. The next weird thing was more definite. On Saturday afternoon, I came back from a hardware store run with a set of those felt pads for chair legs and a door sweep to keep the drafts out. I tossed the bag on the counter and noticed the blinds were open. Not open, but tilted to let light in. I'm particular about that kind of thing. I like them shut when I'm out. I was sure I'd shut them because it's one of those little rituals you invent in a new place. Before I leave, phone, wallet, keys, blinds shut. I even texted a picture of the window to my friend Megan one day with the caption, "My peaceful alley view," and now the slats were angled differently from the picture. I took a mental note and told myself I might be misremembering. I closed them all the way and installed the door sweep. On Sunday morning, there was a slip under my door, reminding tenants that maintenance would be doing a preventative check of AC filters on Monday between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. I work 8 to 4, so I wasn't going to be there. I texted the number on the slip, which was for Evan, and told him to go ahead and that my cat, I don't have a cat, would be in a carrier. That was an old trick a friend taught me. Mention a pet so people are more careful to close the door. He replied with a thumbs up. Monday night, I finally noticed the thing everyone always says you should notice. A sliver of white dust along the baseboard under the mirror in the hallway. It was like bay seasoning sprinkled in a line, except it was just drywall dust. I probably wouldn't have noticed it if I hadn't dropped my keys right by the door and had to get on my hands and knees to fish them out from under the shoe rack. There was no dust elsewhere on the baseboards, and there hadn't been dust before. I would have seen it when I moved in. I stared at the mirror. The frame was flush against the wall. No visible screws. I slid a fingernail under the frame and got nothing. I resisted the urge to pry it. I checked my door cam, one of those peephole cameras you slap on the inside with adhesive. I'd put my old one on because it was lying in a box, and I figured why not? It only records when the door is opened, and I don't have a subscription for cloud storage, so it mostly shows me my comings and goings. I scrolled through the clips and saw a guy in a green maintenance polo let himself in a little after noon. He was in and out in 5 minutes. He had a filter under his arm when he came in, and the old one under his arm when he left. He didn't look at the camera. He didn't look anywhere unusual. It was boring footage, which is what you want with a maintenance guy. I slept poorly that night. Each time I rolled over, I felt like there was a change in the room that I couldn't define. I can't explain that better than that. Sometimes a place is a place, and sometimes it feels like a stage set after the actors have gone home for the night. I turned on the lamp, and that helped. The light made colors normal again. I sat up and scrolled my phone to kill the feeling. I eventually fell asleep with the lamp on. Over the next few days, small things added up. The chain on the bathroom light was wrapped the wrong direction around the base. I wouldn't have noticed if I hadn't hit it with my elbow. The base of the smoke detector had a faint crescent of discolored paint around it, as if it had been twisted half an inch and left in a slightly different orientation. The digital clock I'd unplugged was plugged back in when I got home from work on Thursday and set to 12 o'clock, flashing. I don't know what bothered me more, the fact that it had been plugged in, or the fact that whoever plugged it in hadn't set the time like a normal person would. I texted the landlord. I asked him to confirm whether maintenance had been in again. He replied, "Just Monday for filters." No other entries. I asked if he could check. He replied with a thumbs up and then, "We'll confirm tomorrow." He didn't follow up. Friday. I did the dumb thing everyone does after they've already been made uncomfortable. I asked a stranger on the internet for advice. I searched how to tell if a mirror is two-way and read a dozen contradictory blogs. Tap it with a knuckle, look for a fingernail gap, put a flashlight to the glass. Nothing I read was definitive, but it worked like a seed. I dug a box cutter out of my tool bag and slid it along the wall next to the mirror frame, trying to see if there was a seam. There was a seam. There's always a seam with rental mirrors because they're hung fast and cheap. I told myself that. I told myself a lot of things. I kept seeing another network device pop up on my phone when I scanned for Wi-Fi. ESP_3A9B, then later ESP_3A9C. It would appear, vanish, and appear again. I didn't think much of it. Every apartment building is dense with devices. Still, the name stuck in my head because it looked like a default name. I changed the admin password on my router and checked the logs for unknown MAC addresses. There were a few. Again, dense building. I'm not a security guy. I'm barely a tech guy. But I know enough to know when something feels off. On Saturday, I pulled the alarm clock apart. It's embarrassing to admit that. Nothing about it seemed special. It was a cheap red LED model with a cord. I took out 4 screws and pried it open. There were the boards you'd expect. A little speaker, a ribbon cable for the display, and an empty rectangle where a battery pack could have gone if the manufacturer had used a different model. No secret guts. No SD card. I put it back together and tried not to feel stupid. That afternoon, Megan came by. We went to high school together and she'd moved to the city 2 years before I did. She has that big sister energy even though we're the same age. She brought grocery store sushi and a 6-pack of lime seltzer and said we were christening the place properly. I told her about the dust and the mirror and my fridge making noises, and she laughed at me in a friendly way and told me she'd help me look under the furniture for gremlins. We ended up watching a house renovation show and talking over it, and when she left, around 9, she hugged me at the door and told me to stop doom-scrolling myself into insomnia. I slept a little better because I'd laughed, and because the apartment felt warmer after someone else had been in it and found nothing to fear. I woke up just before sunrise. The room was blue with early light, the kind that makes you squint even with your eyes closed. That's when I noticed the smoke detector light was on. It was a dim orange glow. I hadn't seen it glow before. I lay there and watched it for a minute. It didn't blink. It didn't change. It was just on. I got up and stood on a chair in my socks and pressed the test button. It screamed and I almost fell. I held it until it stopped and climbed down and tried to tell myself I'd been wrong. The light had always been on and I'd just never noticed it. I couldn't make myself believe it. By late morning, I had worked myself into a state I'm not proud of. I wanted to unscrew something. I wanted to have an object in my hands that would prove or disprove the feeling in my chest. I took the smoke detector off the ceiling. It twisted counterclockwise with a little resistance. The mounting plate stayed in the ceiling. The unit came down in my hand. I looked at the back. There was a 9-volt battery. There was also a coin-sized module that didn't look like it belonged. It was double-sided taped to the plastic, with a wire that piggybacked off the battery terminals, and a second thin wire that disappeared under the lip of the housing. My mouth went dry. I turned the unit over and looked for the wire's exit. It was threaded through a hole that looked like a perfectly normal part of the smoke detector's vents. If you didn't take it down, you'd never see it. The wire led to what looked like a pinhole in one of the slots. My heart thumped. I don't know how long I stood there. I was suddenly aware that I was visible, standing on a chair, staring at the thing, and that if it was what I thought it was, someone could see me realizing it. I didn't call the police. Not right away. I wish I could say I did. What I did was more stupid. I took a picture with my phone. Front, back, the little coin module. And then I put the detector back up. I put it back exactly the way it had been and got off the chair and sat on the bed and stared at my phone screen like it was a shield. I zoomed in on the module, trying to read the tiny print on it. I could make out 2.4G and P2P and a string of numbers that could have been a model or could have been nothing. I googled smoke detector camera 2.4G P2P and found page after page of products on shady-looking sites. The pictures looked like mine. The write-ups said things like real-time streaming, night vision, and loop recording to microSD. My hands were shaking. I felt grotesquely exposed in a way I didn't think was possible alone in a locked apartment. I called the landlord then. I told him I needed him to come by. He said he wasn't available until Tuesday. I told him it was urgent. He asked if there was a leak. I said there was an issue with my smoke detector and that it looked like it had been tampered with. He sighed and said he'd send Evan. Evan knocked 20 minutes later. He was taller than I expected, late 40s, a little soft in the middle, with a kind of rehearsed friendly manner. He wore a polo with the building's logo. He stepped inside and wiped his feet on my welcome mat and looked around the place like he was taking inventory of it. I showed him the detector. He took it down and pressed the test button and frowned like I was wasting his time. I told him I'd seen something inside it. He opened the battery compartment and nodded at the 9-volt. He looked at the back and said, "That's the sensor." I pointed at the coin-sized module and said, "What's that?" He looked at me and gave me a look I can only describe as paternal condescension. "That's the alarm's radio. It talks to the system in the hallway. It's code. See?" He tapped it with a fingernail. "They all have it." I felt stupid again. I hated that feeling. He reinstalled it and asked if there was anything else. I said no. He left. I watched his reflection in the hallway mirror as he headed out. In that reflection, I saw him look at the mirror. Not stare. Just glance. The way you do when you look at a thing you know is there and want to make sure it still is. I didn't go back to bed. I put on jeans and walked 2 blocks to a big box electronics store and bought a motion-activated camera. The kind you hide in a teddy bear was on the shelf, and it made me feel physically ill to see how shiny and normal it looked in the aisle. I didn't buy that one. I bought a black rectangular one with a clip, like a body cam. I brought it home, clipped it to my bookshelf facing the front door, and left it plugged in so it wouldn't die. It had a timestamp and saved to MSDRC. I set it to send me an alert when it sensed motion. I tested it by walking past and got a buzz on my phone. I left it there, feeling crazy and calmer at the same time. That afternoon, I went for a long walk and tried to be an ordinary person doing ordinary things. I got a coffee and sat in the park with my back to a tree. I watched a kid in a red jacket try to pop bubbles with his hands. I listened to a woman tell her friend about a job interview. I stayed out for 3 hours until I felt cold and came back because I needed a sweater. When I got to my door, there was a bright rectangle on my phone. Motion alert. It was time-stamped 26 minutes earlier. My stomach dropped. I unlocked the app with the camera on the bookshelf. There were 2 clips. I opened the first one. It showed my front door from across the room. The door opened. Evan came in. He didn't knock. He wore the same polo. He closed the door behind him and stood very still for a second, listening. He looked left, toward the kitchenette. He looked right, down the hall at the bathroom. He walked in a slow circle, stopped under the smoke detector, and looked up. He stood on his toes and put his fingers on the detector like he was making sure it was tight. He sighed, took a little flashlight out of his pocket, and shined it at the hallway mirror. The video's audio wasn't great, but I think he said okay under his breath. He walked to the window and put 2 fingers on the blinds and adjusted the tilt by a single notch. Then he left. I watched the second clip. It was only 10 seconds long. It showed the ceiling. The camera had triggered on something I couldn't see. A shadow. A shift in the light. I replayed it 3 times. Nothing obvious. Maybe it was a glitch. I felt the prickly heat you get when you know you're being laughed at from a place you can't see. I called the landlord again and told him that maintenance had entered my unit without notice. He said they were probably finishing up the filters. Like that was a reasonable thing to do 5 days later. I told him I had video. He said he'd talk to Evan. He sounded annoyed that I had caught him in a lie. That night I turned the lamp on and tried to watch something stupid. I chose a cooking show where everyone was cheerful and made pasta from scratch. At some point I fell asleep. I woke up to my phone buzzing. It was 3:11 a.m. Motion alert. I sat up too fast and got a head rush. I opened the app. The clip showed 30 seconds around a trigger. The front door didn't open. The camera still faced it. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the blinds shifted a fraction. I watched again. It was barely perceptible. A single slat moving, like a slight breath pushed through the window from outside. The window was closed. There was no vent there. I got off the bed and walked to the window and put my palm flat against the glass. It was cold. My breath fogged it in a small oval. I stood there, chest tight, waiting for something I couldn't name. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I blocked out time at work and went down a rabbit hole. I searched model numbers on my modem. I learned how to pull a device list. I ran a scan from my laptop and found 2 devices I didn't recognize. One was named simply Unknown, with a MAC address that started with 84:CC:(A8). The other was a manufacturer prefix I didn't know. I filtered my network so only my laptop and phone and the bookshelf camera could connect. I changed the SSID and password. I turned off WPS. It made me feel like I was doing something, which is a nice feeling, even if what you're doing is basically taping cardboard over a broken window. I left work early that day because I couldn't concentrate. I went home, closed the blinds, and something in me finally snapped. I took a butter knife and wedged it under the frame of the hallway mirror and popped it from the wall. It came off with a gasp, like suction breaking. Behind it was a square cut in the drywall. It was about 8 inches across and had been cut with more care than I expected. A piece of drywall almost exactly the same size as the mirror's backing was screwed to the studs, and in the top left corner of that square was a camera lens no larger than a shirt button. It was mounted behind a black fabric mesh, probably to reduce glare. The camera's body was the size of a matchbox. 2 thin wires ran up into the cavity toward the ceiling. The camera was angled slightly downward, which would have given it a clean view of the studio. Bed, front door, kitchenette, basically everything. I was so angry my teeth hurt. I pulled the screws out with a little driver from my drawer. I held the tiny camera in my palm and stared at it until my eyes blurred. There was a slot for a micro SD card on the side. I fumbled for the card and slid it out. It was 32 gigabytes. It was warm in my fingers like it had been working a long time. I put the mirror back to cover the hole. Then I grabbed my coat and walked to the police station because I needed a place where I could say the words out loud and have them matter. At the desk, I told the officer, who looked like he'd already had a long day, that I'd found a hidden camera in my apartment and that I suspected the building's maintenance guy had been entering without permission. He raised his eyebrows slightly, which might have been sympathy or skepticism. He took my name and address and asked me to wait. After 15 minutes, another officer came out and led me to a room with a desk. I showed him the camera and the SD card and the pictures of the smoke detector and the clip of Evan moving through my place like he owned it. He was quiet in the way of people who are memorizing. He asked me how long I'd lived there, who had a key, whether I'd had any disagreements with the landlord. He asked if I was dating anyone who might have done this. The question made me laugh in a way that wasn't funny. He took the SD card and put it in a little plastic bag and told me they'd take a look. He said, "Don't go back there tonight." I asked him where I should go. He said, "Do you have a friend?" I thought of Megan. I hated the idea of putting this in her life, but I texted her anyway. I told her I needed a couch. She said, "Of course," without asking why. At Megan's, I sat on her floor with my back against her couch and tried not to touch my face because my hands felt filthy, like they had unknown fingerprints on them. We watched a movie about a dog because I asked for something that had nothing like a person in a room in it. I slept less than 2 hours. At 7 a.m., the same officer called. He said, "We pulled video." He paused. There's a lot. It looks like it's been recording for at least a month, maybe more. We need you to come in and make a statement." I asked him what was on it. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "It's your apartment. It's you, sleeping, eating, changing clothes." He coughed. "Showering." My vision tunneled. For a second, I didn't know where my feet were. He said they'd be contacting the landlord, and they wanted me to stay away from the building for a day. I said okay. I hung up and stared at the carpet. Megan put a cup of coffee next to me. I heard my own voice say, "Thank you," from somewhere a few feet to my left. By noon, the building manager had left me a voicemail saying to call him back. When I did, he sounded scared. He said there had been a break-in. He said a vandal had damaged the smoke detector and the mirror and possibly other fixtures. I told him the police had his camera. He said very softly, "Oh." Then he said an attorney would be in touch. He hung up. The police searched the building. They didn't tell me everything. They never do. And I get that. What I heard, from a friend who knew a guy, was that the utility closet on my floor had a cable coming down from the ceiling into a small lockbox that wasn't on any of the building's schematics. The lockbox had a little embedded cell modem and an SD card of its own. It was full. Of what? I don't know. I was told not to speculate. So of course I speculated. I pictured a grid of apartments and a grid of feeds. I pictured someone zooming in on my stupid routine of brushing my teeth in circles, and then checking the oven, and then putting my phone on the charger, like I was winding myself up every night for a music box solo. They arrested Evan 2 days later. I learned this before they intended me to, because there was a clip on the local news website. It showed him being walked to a car in handcuffs, looking dazed and much older than he had in my doorway. The anchor said words like voyeurism and unauthorized surveillance and invasion of privacy, with that firm, neutral tone they teach you in broadcaster school. I turned the volume down and watched his mouth open and close like a fish's. I wondered whether his eyes had ever adjusted to the dark the way mine had. I wondered whether he had watched me fall asleep. I wished that was the end of it. In a way, it would have been better if the story resolved there. Arrest, charges, apologies, maybe a payout I would have felt too dirty to accept. But that's not how it went. I stayed with Megan for a week. We took turns pretending it was normal. I made dinner and did her dishes and folded blankets. She gave me a pillow from her bed and said she liked the smaller one anyway. I had 3 changes of clothes because I didn't want to go back to my building. The landlord texted daily at first, then every other day, asking me to arrange a time to retrieve my belongings under supervision, like I was the threat. I didn't respond. The officer told me they had a search warrant and to sit tight. I sat tight in the most literal sense. If I was moving, I was fine. If I was still, I could feel the camera-shaped holes in the day. 4 days after Evan's arrest, I got an email from a Gmail address I didn't recognize. The subject line was my street name and my apartment number. The body had 1 sentence. You moved the clock. Under it was a single image. It was a screenshot from my studio. Not live, time-stamped from a week earlier, before I took the smoke detector down. The frame was wide, covering most of the room from a high angle. Me, sitting on the edge of my bed, shoes off, bent over looking at my phone. The digital alarm clock on the nightstand, unplugged. The text on the image was faintly pixelated, a watermark of sorts, in the bottom right corner, CAM02. I stared at the sender's address. It was a nonsense string of letters and numbers. I forwarded the email to the officer without thinking, and then sat on the edge of Megan's couch, with my fists pressed to my knees until she finished her shower. When she came out, I handed her my phone. She looked at the image and made a sound like she'd been tapped hard in the stomach. I don't know exactly what the police did with that. Later, I was told that it suggested a feed had been accessed remotely, which they already thought given the cell modem, but that doesn't give you much in the way of comfort. All it does is widen the circle of who might have my face in their head. Evan started to feel like the wrong shape for the problem. The night after the email, I dreamed there were 2 of me. One lay in a bed. The other stood in the corner and watched. I woke up sweating. Megan was a lump of blankets on the couch next to me. The room had a gentle, safe humidity from her humidifier. For a second, I forgot that to someone I was a posture in a room. Then I remembered. I got up, got a glass of water, and on impulse opened Megan's hall closet because I wanted to see something solid. Coats, a vacuum, a plastic bin with Christmas lights. The normalness made me dizzy with relief, and also deeply sad. A day later, I went back to my apartment with 2 officers. I had to go. They said it was time to collect my stuff. We're going to be in there the whole time, one of them said, and he meant it kindly. The door had a new deadbolt, and there was blue tape on the floor around a tripod that had probably taken pictures for the report. The mirror had been taken away as evidence. The hole in the drywall was covered with taped plastic. The smoke detector had been removed. The ceiling had 2 little screw holes where it had been. I moved through my things like they belonged to someone else. I packed my clothes and shoes and a few notebooks and a bag of toiletries. The officers tried not to look at anything, which was the politest thing they could have done, and also impossible for them, and also impossible for me. I didn't take the digital alarm clock. I didn't take the door cam or the router or the microwave. I didn't take the cheap power strip I'd bought the day I moved in, the one with 2 USB ports built into one end. I thought of all the devices in the world with USB ports built into them and wanted to set fire to a warehouse somewhere. I loaded 2 duffel bags and a box into Megan's trunk. I locked my door and gave the key to the officer. We drove away. For 3 days, I lived like a traveler in someone else's place. I began to think the shape of my life would be permanently smaller, like a piece of fabric cut around a stain. I applied to other apartments from Megan's kitchen table and felt like I was selling myself to people for the privilege of renting the privilege of privacy. I taped a large Band-Aid over the camera on my laptop, even though I knew that wasn't the kind of camera I needed to fear. I showered with my eyes closed because the other option was looking at the corners and the light fixtures and the gentle curve where the wall met the ceiling and imagining small eyes there. The second email didn't have text, just an attachment. I almost didn't open it, but the red one on the mail icon throbbed. It was a video. It was 11 seconds long. It played in a box on my phone. The angle was 2 feet off the ground, looking up at a couch. Megan's couch. I watched myself stand up and stretch, and then leave the frame toward the kitchen. The timestamp in the top left corner was exactly 2 hours earlier. There was a watermark in the corner, CAM05. It wasn't the same as the other watermark. Maybe they had different devices. Maybe that means something. It felt like less of an answer and more of a subtraction of one. I didn't show Megan right away because I didn't want to put that in her life. Then I realized I'd already put that in her life just by being there. I showed her. She stared, mouth open, and then turned off the video and put the phone face down on the table and backed up like it was going to roll toward us on its own. "In here?" she asked, in a voice that sounded like she didn't want an answer. "In here," I said. We didn't sit. We stood like people at a fire alarm wait for instructions. She said she was going to call the police. I said I would. I did. While I was on hold, I began looking around the living room as if the device would be wearing a little hat that said camera. The officer who knew my name by then said they were sending someone. He told us to step outside and wait on the sidewalk. We did, under a tree with a trunk painted white at the base to deter bugs. We stood there without talking because anything I could say would collide with something it wasn't big enough to move. 2 officers came and were kind and stiff and did what they were trained to do. They asked if anyone else had a key. They asked if we had any exes who might be pranking us. The questions sounded necessary and irrelevant at the same time. They checked the obvious places first: smoke detectors, outlet plates, light fixtures. One of them went directly to the couch because the video had shown it. He got on his knees and ran his hands under the seam where the fabric met the black dust cover on the bottom. He frowned. He said, "There's a cut here." He pulled and the dust cover gave a little. The staple that was supposed to hold it in had been pried up and pressed back in. He reached inside like he was going to pull out a lost remote. He pulled out a black rectangle the size of a pack of gum with a lens on one side and a wire on the other. The wire ended in a tiny square battery with adhesive on its back. He held it between his thumb and forefinger and made a quiet, involuntary noise. Megan sat down very carefully on the arm of a chair, like she was trying not to move the air too much. The officer asked if either of us had seen the device before. I shook my head and said no. Megan shook her head and said no. The officer bagged it and wrote the time on the bag and then took the couch's dust cover all the way off and checked the rest of the undercarriage. Another wire, this one stuck to the frame with black tape, led to a small plastic donut stuck in the corner. He pulled it free. It narrowed my breath to a pencil line. The sense you get from a room when it's supposed to be yours and it turns out it isn't is less like fear and more like grief. You're trying to feel something that isn't there. We went to a hotel that night. Not fancy. A business traveler place with beige carpets and a breakfast room with a waffle iron chained to the counter. The lamps were mounted to the walls. The smoke detectors were the kind with a green LED that blinked exactly once every 10 seconds, and the pattern of its blink worked on me like a metronome. I lay in the bed and watched the tiny light flick and counted between flashes like a 9-year-old. I eventually slept. At 5 a.m., I woke to the sound of a truck backing up, beep, beep, beeping outside. I stared at the strip of light under the curtains and wondered if it had been a van delivering something I would have to be afraid of. The officer called the next day and said the device from Megan's couch recorded to micro SD and also broadcast over Wi-Fi when it could. The network name was nothing friendly, some default string. It was probably set up from a phone. He said something else too, in the tone of a person delivering a thing he doesn't want to deliver. He said the device had pairs with it. That was how he phrased it at first. When I asked what he meant, he said, clusters. A lot of these are installed as clusters. One near the floor, one high, sometimes one pointing at a door, sometimes one in a light. You shouldn't go looking yourself, but we should check the rest of your stuff. He meant my bags. He meant my power strip. He meant the things you carry with you from one temporary home to another, because they look like things you own. I emptied my duffel on the hotel bed. Socks, shirts, a book, the little black rectangle of my phone charger, 2 coiled cords with Velcro ties. The power strip I'd left behind at the apartment was still behind, but my cheap USB wall charger was with me. I held it. It looked like any cheap charger. 2 prongs, a single USB port, a white plastic body that had dulled to cream. I shook it lightly. Something clicked inside. My throat went dry again. I'm aware chargers have guts, little transformer blocks and coils and things. But this click was like a Lego brick slid in a case. The officer came by with a small kit. He didn't love that we'd called him to a hotel room. He probably wasn't supposed to do that. He popped the USB charger's seam with a little pick like a dentist's tool. The guts came out as a tidy unit. It was not a charger. It had a USB port, sure, but the boards were wrong. One of the boards had a lens the size of a pinhead. I felt the top of my head go hot, an odd sensation I'd never had before. Then my vision swam a little, and I put my hand on the bed to make sure I was still in the correct gravity. The officer asked where I'd gotten the charger. I said I didn't know. It might have been from my old apartment. It might have been from my studio. I had a lot of duplicates. This could have been the one next to my bed that I used every night to charge my phone, and that I had automatically tossed into my bag on the way out. He nodded and bagged it, and said quietly that this was starting to look bigger. He didn't say what bigger meant. He didn't have to. Bigger meant not just one person. Bigger meant this might not be about a maintenance guy with a ladder and too much time. I moved into a new place 3 weeks later because I had to. I knew I wouldn't sleep until my stuff lived somewhere, and I could close a door, and it would be mine. It was a small 1-bedroom over a florist. The landlord was a woman in her 60s who met me at the door with a list of rules printed on bright pink paper. Nothing about her felt slippery. I told her I was quiet and paid on time and kept my own counsel. She said, "Good. Bring me your smoke detector every month so I can test it." I told her that was a sentence I was glad to hear. She laughed like she didn't understand why and told me to sign on the line. I bought new everything. New power strips, new lamps, new blender, new coffee maker, new phone charger. It felt like buying a uniform for a job I didn't want. I threw away too much. I threw away things that were gifts. I threw away things that had a little life left in them. I told myself it was cleansing. It wasn't. It was just subtraction. But subtraction can feel like progress when your life has too many variables. For a month, nothing happened. That's its own kind of horror. Waiting for the floor to give. I worked. I came home. I watched TV shows with laugh tracks like I was feeding something in me on a drip. Megan came over once with a plant and put it on the sill, and then immediately took it out of the pot to check for anything that wasn't roots. We laughed and didn't talk about it. Laughing is a form of not talking. One Saturday, I went to the farmer's market because it was there, and because walking among people who want to buy tomatoes felt like a healthy thing to do. I bought bread wrapped in a paper sleeve. I bought a jar of honey. I bought a pair of cheap sunglasses and immediately felt virtuous for spending cash on something that had nothing to do with fear. On the way home, I stopped at a thrift store and bought a floor lamp with a heavy base because the light in my living room was dim and I wanted a pool of light to read in. The lamp had a built-in USB port in the stem, which made me hesitate, but it was boxed and looked unused, and I told myself that they didn't make lamps without them anymore, and that my aversion was a superstition I was indulging too far. I took it home, assembled it, plugged it in, and read 2 chapters of a novel about a man who builds a boat inside his house and then has to take down the walls to get it out. When it got dark, I turned the lamp off and watched the window go black. At 11, there was a knock. I froze, then stood, then sat, then stood again. The knock came again, 2 polite taps. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. A man in a FedEx uniform stood there holding a thin package. I hadn't ordered anything. I opened the door a wedge and said hello. He smiled without showing teeth and handed me the package and asked for a signature. I signed and closed the door and locked it and carried the package to the counter. It didn't feel heavy. It didn't feel like anything. The label had my name and address. The return address was a P.O. box with a city I didn't recognize. I cut the tape. Inside was a single piece of printer paper and a USB flash drive. The paper had a sentence in large font. "We never needed the apartment." I stared at it. For a long moment, nothing in my head made words. Then a lot of words all said the same thing. "Don't plug that in." I called the officer. I had his number like I'd have a dentist's. He said he would send someone. I put the flash drive in a sandwich bag and put the bag in the freezer because I didn't know what else to do with it that felt like containment. It looked stupid, fogged with cold next to a Tupperware of soup. The officer came and took it. He didn't even try to joke. He told me to stay with Megan that night. I didn't argue. They wrote later, in a letter that used the word ongoing, that the flash drive contained still images, 36 of them. The first 25 were screenshots from the camera in my old hallway. Me, in various states of living. The next 10 were from Megan's couch. The last one was from my new apartment. It was a picture of my living room, my lamp in the corner, the plant on the sill, the bread on the counter. It was taken from near floor level, 2 feet off the ground. The lamp's base was solid. The USB port in the stem was powered. There was a watermark in the bottom right corner of the image. It said CAM09. I unplugged everything in the apartment and slept on the floor in the bathroom with the door open and my head toward the hall, as if that would keep anything from coming down it. In the morning, after a rational part of my brain had had a chance to be heard, I took the lamp apart. It turned out the stem unscrewed in segments. In the base, under a disc of felt, was a cavity. In the cavity was a plastic shell the size of a deck of cards. It was taped to the inside with double-sided foam tape. It took me a minute to pry it out. When it came free, stray wiring came with it. Threads that looked like spider silk, but were actually plastic sheathed. The shell cracked in my hand. Something inside clicked. I set it on the counter and stepped away like it was an animal. I called the officer. I called Megan. I put on my coat and waited outside in the cold, because I couldn't be in the room with it. He came and bagged it, and asked again where I'd gotten the lamp. I told him. He called the thrift store. They didn't have records that went back more than a week. He asked whether I'd told anyone where I was moving. I said no. He asked if I had posted any photos from my new place. I said no. He asked if anyone had been in the apartment besides me and Megan. I thought of the FedEx man. Then I thought, it could have been planted in the thrift store, or in the donation bin, or in a warehouse, or in a truck, or in a factory, or anywhere in the chain of everything that comes into a human life. That's when the story tilted from personal to systemic. There isn't a single neat enemy when you don't know who installed the eyes. There isn't even a neat object. Every object becomes an eye. I stopped buying anything with a plug for a while. I used candles and showered in the dark. I knew it wasn't a solution. I knew I was just making my world smaller in a way the other side would probably find funny. But you do what you can do. I know the part you want. You want a resolution. You want to know if they caught anyone else and if someone went to prison and if I got my sense of self back. I can give you pieces. The officer called me months later and told me there had been an indictment. Not just Evan, 2 others. One worked for a contractor that serviced multiple buildings in the area. The second was a username tied to an IP that resolved to a house 1 town over. Voyeuristic network, the press called it. The phrase sounded like jargon and like a specific nightmare at the same time. The man 1 town over had a room with a bank of monitors. He had a spreadsheet with names and addresses and notes. On my line it said, quiet, 7:30 shower, plays guitar badly, rarely calls. I don't play guitar. That was someone else. Mistakes were baked in. I was a row in a workbook, and so was a woman a block away, and a man 3 floors up, and a couple who thought they had been entertaining themselves privately after midnight. I didn't read the rest of the notes on me because reading them felt like letting them burn holes through something that had already been thin. As for me, I moved again. Not far. Above a florist to above a bakery. The smell at least is better. The smoke detector in this place is one of those big white ones with a tamper ring. The landlord installed it while I watched. I felt ridiculous making her let me watch, but she nodded like she understood a ritual and screwed it into the ceiling with a shiny new plate. She let me tug on it myself to see it was solid. There's a sticker on it with her initials and the date. I look at that sticker more than I should. I have a small ritual now. When I come home, I say hello to the empty room. Not because I think the room can hear me, but because I want to hear the sound of my voice in it. I do a lap. Window, blinds, smoke detector, mirror, outlets. It takes 30 seconds. It's not foolproof. It's not anything proof. But it's what stands between me and the feeling that I'm walking on glass under the carpet. I replaced my phone charger with one I bought at a boring chain with a receipt and a 3-year warranty. And I rotate 2 of them so I'll notice if one takes a walk on its own. I still cover my laptop camera with tape. It looks childish and makes me feel better. Some nights I sleep. Some nights I wake at 3:11 for no reason I can explain and stare at the thin line of the door and listen to the building settle and count breaths until the numbers feel like a ladder. Once, a month ago, I found an envelope in my mailbox with no return address. Inside was a photo printed on cheap paper. It was a still from some camera somewhere. It was a hallway I didn't recognize. The angle was slightly upward, toward a fixture on the ceiling. The timestamp was the day before, a time when I was at work. The watermark said CAM 12. On the back of the photo, someone had written in ballpoint pen, "Sometimes we don't even need a lens." I don't know what that means. Maybe it means nothing. Maybe it means there are microphones where I don't think about them. Maybe it means human beings are cameras when their attention is pointed like a device. I threw the photo away in a trash can 4 blocks from my apartment, and then I took the trash out at my place, and then I walked around the block twice, and then I came home and sat with my back against my bed and breathed for a while. People ask me, when I tell the story, whether I ever felt them watching. If there was a moment when I looked up and saw the corner of the room and had a sense that a stranger's pupils were pointed through it. I wish I could say yes, because then maybe I could trust that sense in the future. But the truth is, I didn't feel it. I just noticed the debris it left. Dust on the baseboard, a blind tilted 1 notch wrong, a maintenance guy in the wrong place on the wrong day. I didn't feel their eyes. I felt their housekeeping. I still have the first micro SD card in an evidence bag the police gave back to me after the case, because they took clones of it and didn't need the original anymore. I don't know why they gave it back. It sits in a drawer I don't open. Sometimes I think about throwing it into the river. But even that feels like making an offering to something I don't understand. So it stays. If I took it out and broke it with a hammer, I don't know if I would feel victorious or scared I'd be destroying a piece of proof I might need someday. The other night, I woke up at 2:30 to a clicking sound. It took me right back to that studio with the old fridge in the humming street and the mirror with the scratches you can't make sense of. I got up and stood in the middle of my living room in the dark and listened. The clicking stopped. The streetlights outside made an orange grid on my floor through the blinds. I turned the lamp on and then off again, because I don't entirely trust lights anymore. I sat on the floor. After a minute, I started to laugh. Not because anything was funny, but because the alternative was chewing my own lips bloody. I laughed until my breathing slowed, and then I put my head against the couch and felt the fabric against my cheek. And it was scratchy and real, and it meant nothing to anyone except me. When I finally went back to bed, I put my phone face down, as if that was meaningful, and I said out loud to the empty room, "Good night." in the same tone I'd use if someone I loved were still awake in the next room. It felt like giving a password to a door that isn't a door anymore. I closed my eyes. I counted 10 seconds and waited for the blink of the green light that isn't there. I slept. In the morning I woke and made coffee and stood in my kitchen while it brewed and watched the steam rise in a single empty column. And for a few minutes I didn't look at any corners at all. I signed a 6-month lease on a farmhouse because the photos had good light and the rent was cheaper than a studio in town. The listing called it rural chic. It was an hour from my job if traffic behaved, 90 minutes if it didn't. The house sat on a long stretch of 2-lane road, with a shoulder made of chopped gravel that got into your tires. Behind it was a field that, depending on which direction you looked, was wheat or corn, or just grass that had given up and gone to weeds. The owner, a woman named Carol, lived 2 counties over and said her son usually handled things. The son, she said, was busy with harvest. She said it like that was a sentence that ended other sentences. The first time I pulled into the driveway, I almost drove past because there's nothing about an old farmhouse that jumps out until you already know it. The front was a face, 2 windows for eyes, a door for a mouth. The porch sagged the way porches do in pictures that aren't trying to sell you anything. The lockbox code was a sequence of numbers in Carol's email that also included a reminder not to let the barn cats inside. I didn't see any cats that day. What I saw was a sky that looked like a plain white plate, and a yard that felt bigger than a yard should. Inside, the house was cleaner than the outside suggested. Light wood floors, a couch with cushions that still had the stitched tag you're supposed to cut off, a kitchen with a stove that clicked 3 times before the gas caught. The outlets had those older, almond-colored covers instead of white ones. They made the walls look like teeth. The bathroom had a window that looked out over the back field, and the mirror had a bevel that distorted your face if you leaned in too close. The bedroom was a simple rectangle. The bed had a steel frame that squealed exactly once when I set my box spring on it, and then went quiet like I had startled it into silence. The quiet was the selling point. The quiet was also what made me uneasy from the first night. It wasn't the absence of sound. It was the way sound had space to travel. Even small things went for miles. When the fridge cycled, it sounded like a car pulling up the drive. When the wind hit the side of the house just right, a loose piece of tin on the barn flapped like a bird trapped behind ductwork. The nearest neighbor was 1.5 miles down, a man named Denny, who mowed his yard in a square pattern and waved with 2 fingers lifted from the steering wheel whenever he passed me on the road. He never stopped. He had the air of a person who knows the names of plants that look like weeds. I brought almost nothing with me. Some clothes, a coffee maker, 2 lamps, a folding table for a desk, and a box of books. The house came furnished, which saved me the trouble of trying to get a couch that size through a door that narrow. On the second day, I drove into town for groceries and came back with bags of pantry food and a pack of those sticky mouse traps because the listing had mentioned the occasional critter. I set the traps under the sink and behind the stove and made a mental note to be okay with whatever I found. I am not a country person. I can change a tire, but I can't tell a coyote from a dog at a distance, and I don't pretend to like that about myself. At dusk, the sky went from white to a gray that made every dark shape look like a person. I stood on the back step with a beer and tried to feel the calm the listing had promised. It came in a single breath and left. The field rippled once as if a hand had run across it. I heard something that I told myself was wind catch on the barn's broken door, and then let go. A pickup rolled by on the road, and then there was nothing again, not even insects, which struck me as odd, but not odd enough. My first night I kept a lamp on in the living room and fell asleep on the couch with my shoes off and one sock halfway on and the other somewhere on the floor. The kind of sleep that isn't sleep so much as a repeat of closing your eyes to see if your body will do it. I woke at 2:43 a.m. because the house made a noise that wasn't the house, and it took me a full minute to understand it was a single knock. Not the hollow thump of a branch, not the tick of heat changing pipes. A knock, like the way polite people do when they're not sure you want them there. I lay still because every part of me thought I was dreaming. Then there was another knock, 4 seconds apart, like someone counting in a song. I sat up with my heart beating hard enough to feel in my palms and listened. The third knock came from the kitchen door, the one that led to the back step. I don't know how I knew it was that door instead of the front. It was just the way houses sound different when they're being touched from different sides. I stood up and walked to the kitchen as if I had practiced what to do next. I didn't turn the light on. I stood 3 feet back from the door and looked at the small diamond of window at the top. It was black glass reflecting a vague shape of me. I didn't want to get closer. I said, "Hello?" in a voice that sounded like I didn't belong to it. Silence. Then the sound of a shoe sliding on the step, the tiny grit sound of it, and then nothing. I waited. The house held its breath, and the only sound was the fridge waking up and deciding it had a job to do. I stood there until my calves hurt. Then I went back to the couch and sat with my feet on the floor and held my phone like a talisman and didn't call anyone because I couldn't think of what I'd say. At sunrise, the field looked harmless again. I opened the door like I was trying not to wake it and stepped out. The 2 concrete steps were damp. The top one had a dark crescent where someone's shoe had paused. The crescent faced the door. I stuck my finger in it because that seemed like a thing to do, and got water and dirt. Not paint, not a trick of color. The grass pressed down in a shape that could have been a heel. It pointed toward the field, not the road. I texted Carol a polite version of, "Someone knocked on the back door last night." She called instead of texting back. Her voice was thin, like a radio signal from too far away. She said I should keep the doors locked and not open them after dark, which would have sounded condescending if she hadn't said it like she had learned it the hard way. She asked if I wanted her son to come by. I said no. I didn't want a stranger in the house more than I wanted a stranger at the door. The days settled into a pattern. I drove to work and watched the road curl between fields like a ribbon on end. I came home and made simple dinners. I sat on the back steps and tried to like the idea of silence, as much as I liked the phrase. I slept on the couch again, because the living room felt like it had more exits. Every morning there was dew, and every morning I checked for footprints and told myself it was becoming a hobby. Twice I found the crescent shape. Once I didn't. Once there were 2. On the 4th night, I heard what I thought was an animal under the house. A scrabble, a weight shifting on something hollow. I stood barefoot on the kitchen floor and felt the faintest vibration. I pictured raccoons, or a cat I had failed to keep out of the barn. I opened the cellar door, which is a generous word for the square in the kitchen floor with a handle, and looked down into the crawl space. The light switch turned on a single bulb that hung from a wire and made the whole space look like a photograph of itself. I saw nothing moving. I smelled damp earth and insulation. I turned the light off and closed the hatch and put a chair on it because I am not brave in the way the people in stories are. The next morning there was a note in my mailbox. It was folded twice like something your friend would pass you in class, lined paper torn from a spiral. The handwriting was careful and old-fashioned. It said, "Please bring the light in at night." There was no name. The word light was underlined once. I stood in the gravel at the end of the drive and looked at the road and felt exposed and irrational at the same time, like someone had told me I'd left my shirt inside out in public. I hadn't left any lights on outside that I knew of. There was a single bulb over the front door and another over the kitchen. Both had switches inside. I keep them off because the stars looked better without them. I folded the note and put it in my pocket, and then took it out and folded it again and put it in the glove box. That night I turned on the porch light to see what would happen. It drew moths that thumped against the glass like small, determined hands. At 11:15, there was a knock. Not on the door, on the porch post. A single rap, like someone was tapping a rhythm only they knew. I went to the window next to the door and looked through the curtain gap. I saw the empty porch bathed in weak yellow light. I saw the post. I saw what might have been a dark shape at the edge of the yard, but it could have been a tree pretending to be a person, or the other way around. I stood there a long time, and then I turned off the light. The shape didn't move. The dark swallowed the porch with relief. The next morning there were muddy fingerprints on the porch post at shoulder height. 4 prints and the smudge where a thumb would have been, dragged. I measured the span with my hand. It was bigger. I washed the post with the hose, and the water ran brown down the steps, and the house looked the same afterward, which somehow made me feel worse. I started driving a different route home. It added 12 minutes, but I liked the long curve by the silo and the sense that I was taking away a person wouldn't expect. I stopped in town for gas, even when I didn't need it, so I could stand under bright lights and feel anonymous while I watched the pumps do their numbers. One evening, a man in a brown jacket said, "You're in the old Grattan place?" I nodded because I didn't know how to say yes in the local language. He said, "Watch your lights," and turned and went inside to pay with cash, and left me there with my pump and my new collection of sentences that sounded like nothing until you put them next to each other. The first time I saw the barn cat, it wasn't a cat. It was 3. They sat in a line along the fence facing the field like people at a parade. They were serious about it. One was orange with a notched ear. One was gray and dusty like it had smoked 2 packs a day. One was black and looked like it would be a nice cat to hold if it ever allowed that. They did not look at me. They watched the field the way I had learned to watch the door. I felt an urge to introduce myself to them, which I did not do, because I did not want to be the person who talks to cats like they are security guards. They came every evening for 3 evenings, and then they didn't come at all. The day after they stopped showing up, I found a pile of feathers near the barn that looked like a pillow had exploded. The feathers had a yellow down near the quill. I don't know birds. I know enough to be unhappy when there's a lot of one part of one bird in one place. On a Friday, I came home in the rain. The road had that smell, like wet dust and rubber that makes you think of summers you didn't have. The field made a sound like it was applauding very softly. I pulled into the drive and sat in the car longer than I needed to, listening to wipers and the kind of silence that comes from a steady sound. When I finally went inside, the power flickered twice and then stayed on. I set my bag down by the door and put a pot on the stove for pasta and listened to the house adjust to the water on its skin. At dusk, the rain stopped. The clouds thinned to a smear. The porch light clicked on by itself. It does that. There's a sensor. I had never thought about the sensor. I turned the light off at the switch because of the note. Then I went to the bedroom for the first time in a week because I was tired of the couch. The bedroom had a single window with a view of the side yard and a stretch of woods beyond the fence line. The woods weren't dense. Thin trunks, a lot of scraggly underbrush that had made peace with living in the shade. I stood and watched them for no reason I can explain. Sometimes you look at something long enough that your eyes start making patterns. You see faces in bark, animals in leaf shapes. The hair on my arms rose in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. For a second I thought I saw a pale oval between two trees, the way you see your own skull if someone shines a light at your face from below. Then a wind ran through the leaves and the oval turned into whatever it had been before, which was likely nothing. I closed the curtain and went to brush my teeth. It happened at 12:19 because I looked at the stove clock while it was happening. I was at the sink rinsing a glass, and the house exhaled through the vents, and the floor had a tremor like someone had jumped somewhere else in the building, except there's nowhere else in the building. And then the back door's deadbolt clicked. It didn't open. It just clicked, as if someone on the other side had tried the knob and then put their hand on the bolt and changed their mind. I stood with my hands in the sink and water over my knuckles and waited for the rest of whatever that gesture was supposed to be. It didn't come. My heart did a thing I remember from being a kid, a spasm, and then a race that left my lips buzzing. I turned the faucet off very slowly and wiped my hands on my shirt and walked to the door and looked at the bolt and saw it was still horizontal. I put my palm on it and felt it vibrate once, like a muscle twitch. I jerked my hand back and then stood there, angry at myself for flinching, and then I put my hand on it again, and it was just metal. I slept maybe 40 minutes, dreamless. Around dawn, I got in my car and followed the gravel road past my driveway. After a quarter mile, there was a dirt turnoff with an old sign that said County Easement in letters that had been painted over and repainted until they looked like they were written in two languages at once. I parked, got out, and walked along the fence line with the kind of fake casual posture people have when they are thinking of turning around. The ground sucked at my shoes. 20 yards in, I found where the fence was lower, like someone had gone over it more than once. The wire was twisted back on itself. The grass had two trails, not quite parallel, as if two people had learned a route and taken it enough times to teach it to the ground. I followed it. It led to the back corner of my property, where the field turns into woods, and the woods turn into the kind of nothing that looks like something for a while, and then stops. There, in the fork between two small trees, was a mason jar with a lid that had rusted at the edges. Inside the jar was a folded piece of paper and a strip of something pale I could not name. I told myself it was an old Band-Aid. I told myself it was a ribbon. I told myself to leave it alone. I did not leave it alone. I unscrewed the lid and took out the paper. It was damp and stuck to itself, and it tore as I opened it. It said simply, in that same old-fashioned hand, "Turn the house." The word "turn" had been written over something else. I held it up to the light and could make out face. I put the paper back in the jar, and the strip of pale thing shifted, and I had to close my eyes for a second, because I understood what I had been holding might not have been something you buy in a store. I screwed the lid on hard and put the jar back and wiped my hands on my jeans like sap had gotten on them. I went home and sat on the front steps and thought about how a person turns a house. The house faces the road. The house isn't a tent. Carol's son, when I finally called him, didn't laugh. He said, "We had a blight years back. My dad used to say the house looked the wrong way for this ground." He said it like it was a joke, and then he didn't. He was a man who didn't change things, though. He said it like I would know what that meant. I asked what I was supposed to do with that information. He said, "I don't know. We keep the porch light off after dark. We keep the back light off too. We don't stand in the window. We don't take pictures against the glass." He said the last part sharply, like it was addressed to someone else. That night I put a chair in front of every window, because you can't move a house, but you can move yourself. I ate dinner at the table that faced the interior wall. I turned my phone's camera toward the back of a drawer the way people do on movies when they don't want to be watched. I set a pot of water boiling because the sound made the air thick with something other than the inside of my head. The knock came at 10:07, which made me feel stupid for expecting it later. It came not from the door, not from the post, but from beneath the living room, as if knuckles had wrapped the underside of the floor. 3 times. A pause. 2 times. The room was warm from the stove. I wondered if you can hear blood moving in wood. I stood up and went to the edge of the cellar door and pressed my bare heel to the seam. I felt nothing. I put my ear to the floor. The wood smelled clean in the way old wood does when it is dry. I heard the second series of knocks through my jaw more than through my ear. I sat back and pressed my hands to my temples and had the sensible thought that I should drive to a hotel. I didn't. I sat on the floor and waited for it to stop. And it did. Not all at once, but like a person getting tired of making a point. What I did next is what made everything after make a kind of sense to me. I went outside with the flashlight and walked the perimeter of the house in my socks like I was trying to memorize its shape in the dark. The night was cold enough to make me see my breath. In the beam, the house's siding looked like skin. The flashlight batteries were half strong and tunneled the world so that anything outside the circle was another world. At the back of the house, near the kitchen door, the ground had a square patch where the grass didn't grow right. It was exactly the size of the cellar stump, the concrete block under the floor hatch. I crouched and touched the ground. It was packed, not soggy like the rest. There were hair-thin scratches in the dirt, a curlicue pattern that, if I had found it in a notebook, I would have called doodling. Out here it looked like something pressed lightly and repeatedly by a purposeful hand. The scratches converged toward the center of the square, like little rivers drawn on a child's map. I shined the light toward the field, and the first row of stalks looked like a crowd with their heads bowed. I swung the light like an idiot to prove to myself I could still move it. When I turned back to the house, there was a wet handprint on the kitchen door's glass. It wasn't there before. My flashlight beam made it shine. I stared at it for so long that my brain stopped showing it as a hand and started showing it as something algorithmic. I reached out and touched the glass and got nothing but cold. The print was on the inside. I went in through the front. The kitchen smelled like soil. The handprint had 5 fingers and a thumb like a drawing in a kindergarten class. The fingers were long, not cartoon long, just longer than mine. The palm had a narrow heel. I looked at my own hand against it and didn't touch it because I couldn't bring myself to overlay my skin on whatever had made it. I don't know how long it takes mud to dry, but I watched it for 10 minutes and it didn't crack. I wiped it away with a paper towel because I couldn't stand to have it there, and also couldn't stand not to know that it had been there. The paper towel left streaks. I put the paper towel in the trash under the sink and then took it back out and put it in another bag and tied the bag and took it to the trash can on the side of the house because I didn't want it in the place where I also put onion peels. I slept in the front seat of my car with the keys in my hand. I woke up 3 times with the kind of neck pain that makes you catch your breath. At sunrise, there was frost on the windshield, and in the frost, delicate lines that took me a second to understand were not random. Each line ended abruptly at the edge of the windshield, as if they had been drawn with a finger and then stopped by glass. The lines met and crossed in a simple shape that a kid could draw without looking, a square with a smaller square inside it, a house inside a house. I turned the defrost on and watched it melt from the center outward. I called Carol again. I told her I was having trouble with people on the property. I didn't tell her about the handprint or the knocks. I told her about the note and the lights. She listened without making noise and then said, "You can break the lease." I said I couldn't afford to. She said, "Pay me for what you stay and I'll return the deposit." She said it like she was giving me a way to leave church early without making a scene. I told her I needed a day to think. She said, "Of course." And then after a pause, "Don't stand in the windows." I told her I knew. She said, "My mother used to say the house is a body." She said if it faces wrong, you don't stand where the eyes should be. The last night I spent there, I tried to pretend I had already left. I packed a bag and put it by the door. I unplugged everything but the fridge. I ate a sandwich standing up without a plate because plates suddenly seemed ceremonial. Denny's truck slowed on the road and then kept going. I sat on the floor with my back to the couch and watched the space above the television like it might tell me something. Around 10, the sound started. It wasn't a knock. It was a dragging, the sound of something soft being pulled across wood in a straight line. It began at the back of the house, under the kitchen, and it moved forward slowly, like someone pulling a rope hand over hand. It stopped under the wall that separates the living room from the bedroom. Then it lifted. I can't explain how I knew that. It just wasn't on the wood anymore. It was in the air. The house seemed to breathe in. The front window made a sound, a little click. The sound windows make when the frame changes temperature. The dragging moved onto the front porch. Then came 3 raps on the siding, shoulder height, like before. And then 3 raps lower, like someone had changed their mind mid-knock about where a knock should land. I stood up because I couldn't sit. I didn't go to the window. I went to the hallway and stood where I could see the front door and the back door, as if that perspective would make me right. The porch light turned on by itself. It did that sometimes, I told myself. It swung with a little wind that hadn't been there a second ago. On the door, at knob height, there was a shape like a shadow's shadow. It pressed in, then released, then again, then a third time. The keyhole was dark in a way that made me think something dark was on the other side of it. I don't know if I spoke the words, or if I thought them at the door, but what formed in me was, I'm leaving. The house creaked in a pattern I had come to recognize as settling, which you can talk yourself into meaning anything. I grabbed my bag and my keys and walked out the back, because it felt dumber and therefore safer. On the steps there were 2 wet crescents where shoes had been, and between them something had been dragged that had left a single curving line like a tail, or like the Oakley logo if you turned it flat. I stepped over it and went to my car and drove with the dome light on all the way to town and slept in a motel next to a highway where other people's engines made a sound I wanted to fold myself into. In the morning, I texted Carol and said I was done. She said, "Okay," and added, before I could thank her for the kindness, "Leave the key on the kitchen counter. Don't turn on the light. I'll send my son tomorrow at daybreak." I asked if I should wait for him. She said, "No," and then she said, "Thank you for not turning on the light," and hung up. I went back midday to pull my last box in the coffee maker. The house looked like a set someone had struck. The porch was clean. The handprint was only in my memory and on the paper towel in a trash can in a place I didn't want to think about. Inside, the kitchen smelled like nothing, and I decided that was a smell I could live with wanting. I put the key on the counter and hesitated, and then placed it slightly crooked, because I had the urge to leave the room a little different from how I found it. I stepped outside, closed the door, and walked to my car without turning around until I did. In the second-story window, the one over the porch that I had never used because I didn't need that room, the curtain moved. Not like a draft. Like a person had been standing there and had shifted their weight an inch. I drove to town, then to another, then to the interstate. I moved into a small apartment above a dentist's office that smelled like fluoride on rainy days. The first night, the upstairs neighbor walked heavy, and the sound made me laugh with relief. Some evenings, when the light is going, and everything that's supposed to look warm looks warm, I open my kitchen window, and it frames a square of brick and a triangle of sky, and 2 pigeons arguing on a ledge, and I feel a human size inside myself again. I still think about the note in the jar. I imagine the person who wrote it, bending over with a pencil, trying to say something to someone who might never read it. I imagine turning a house like a person might turn a face. Some nights I wake at 2:43 because muscle memory is its own clock. The sounds I hear now are human. Laughter that escapes a window, footsteps, a television from 2 doors down. Sometimes I miss the dark, the way you miss a place that didn't want you, but taught you how to listen. Last week, an envelope came to my new mailbox, addressed in the same careful hand, with no return address. Inside was a photograph, cheap paper, not professionally printed. It showed a field at dusk. In the foreground, 3 cats sat on a fence. Behind them, far back, was the house. The windows were black. The porch light was off. The photo was taken from a low angle, like the photographer had crouched in the ditch. On the back, in pencil, were 4 words. "Thank you for listening." I held it until my hand warmed the paper. Then I put it in a drawer with my lease, and the instruction manual for the coffee maker, and the spare key to the dentist's office that I should probably give back. That night I dreamed of a house turning slowly on a square of earth until its windows faced the black trees, and then the road, and then the field, and then the road again, like hands on a clock. In the dream, the house stopped, and the porch light, of its own mind, stayed off. I woke up at the moment before I would have seen who was standing on the porch, and that felt like the fairest ending I could ask for.